You shouldn't have shown up, Sloane. The reek of your bargain bin lifestyle is practically curdling the caviar. The words weren't just spoken. They were spat with a venom that felt physical. Genevieve stood before me, her designer silk gown shimmering like liquid diamonds under the massive baccarat chandeliers of the grand ballroom. The air in the glass estate, my estate, was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the smug satisfaction of the elite. Before I could even draw a breath to respond, Genevieve tilted her hand with a practiced, feline grace. A full glass of vintage Bordeaux, deep and red as a fresh wound, cascaded down the front of my cream-colored dress. The ballroom, which seconds ago had been a roar of laughter and clinking crystal, fell into a suffocating, vacuum-like silence. The orchestra stopped mid-note, the violin's last screech echoing against the marble walls. I felt the warmth of the wine soaking through the fabric, staining my skin, heavy and humiliating. It felt like blood. "Oh my God!" Genevieve gasped, a theatrical, mocking hand flying to her mouth as her bridesmaids giggled behind her. "I am so sorry, darling. I forgot that cheap polyester isn't as absorbent as real silk. Does that thrift store rag even cost more than the wine I just wasted on it?" I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for a napkin like a wounded animal. I stood perfectly still, watching the red stains spread across my chest, like a map of the war that was about to begin. I slowly raised my arm and checked my watch. 7:32 p.m. I looked up at Dominic, my brother, my only living blood relative. He was standing 3 feet away, looking dashing in a tuxedo I had indirectly paid for, holding a glass of champagne. He had watched the woman he was about to marry humiliate his sister in front of the most powerful people in the Hamptons. He didn't step forward. He didn't offer his jacket. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink and looked away. His eyes filled with a cowardly, cold indifference. "Dominic?" I whispered, my voice tight, vibrating with a suppressed volcanic rage that had been dormant for years. "Are you really going to stand there?" "Don't make a scene, Sloane," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hushed whispers of the crowd. "You've always been dramatic. Go to the back and clean yourself up. You're embarrassing us in front of Genevieve's family. We have investors here." The last tether of loyalty snapped in my chest with a soundless, violent crack. The sadness I had carried. The memories of me working 3 jobs so he could finish his MBA. The nights I skipped meals so he could afford his first office. It all evaporated. In its place was a crystalline, lethal clarity. Beatrice, Genevieve's mother and a high-ranking HR director who treated life like a corporate restructuring, stepped forward then. She looked at the red mess on my dress with utter disgust, as if I were a cockroach that had dared to crawl onto her pristine white carpet. "Callum!" she snapped, beckoning the head of security. "Get this person out of the sight line of the guests immediately. We have the senator coming in 15 minutes. Take her to the vendor table in the kitchen corridor. She can eat the leftover hors d'oeuvres with the help. That's more her speed anyway." Callum, a man built like a granite mountain, stepped forward. He didn't grab me. He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second. He knew. Every member of the security team in this building knew exactly who I was. I had hired them. I signed their paychecks through SR Holdings. "Ma'am," Callum started to whisper, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and fear. "Do it, Callum," I said, my voice like a serrated blade. "Lead the way." He escorted me through the crowd. I walked with my head held high, the red wine dripping from my hem onto the polished oak floors. floors I had paid to restore last summer. I passed the mahogany bar, the $10,000 floral arrangements, and the guests who looked at me with pitying sneers. I stood in the narrow gap between the heavy velvet curtains and the stage, watching them through a sliver of darkness. From this vantage point, the ballroom looked like a gilded cage. Dominic was laughing now, leaning in to whisper something into Genevieve's ear that made her throw her head back in a practiced, melodic giggle. They looked perfect. They looked expensive. And every single cent of that perfection was built on the scorched earth of my sacrifice. As the security team began to move into their positions, dark shadows circling the perimeter of the light, my mind drifted back to 3 years ago. The world remembered that year for its economic volatility, but I remembered it for the biting cold. I remembered sitting in my studio apartment in Queens, wearing 3 layers of sweaters because the heating vent only blew lukewarm air and I couldn't justify the extra $80 on the utility bill. My dinner was a bowl of 99-cent ramen for the 14th night in a row. I wasn't broke. By then, my first 2 commercial flips had already netted me my first $1 million. But I lived like a ghost because I had a secret to keep. The phone had rung at 2 a.m. back then. It was Dominic, his voice frantic, sobbing. "Sloan, please. The investors, they're going to take the house. Dad's heart can't take another eviction notice." I messed up. The startup, the $650,000 is gone. I'm going to jail. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if I was eating. He just asked for a miracle. I gave it to him. I wired the money through an anonymous LLC SR Holdings, making him believe a silent venture GA had seen potential in his failing firm. I didn't do it for him. I did it so my parents could die in the only home they ever loved. I drove a car with a taped-up window for 2 years so Dominic could drive a leased BMW to client meetings to maintain his image. I lived in the dark so he could bask in the light. And how did he repay me? By letting his bride-to-be treat me like a stain on her carpet. I looked out at the dance floor. Genevieve was now showing off her engagement ring to a group of socialites. That ring, a 4-carat emerald cut, cost exactly $85,000. I knew, because the jeweler had called SR Holdings to verify the line of credit Dominic had used. My credit, my sweat, my blood. "She's a predator, isn't she?" I jumped slightly. Callum, the security head, was standing beside me in the wings. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Genevieve. "She's a consumer, Callum." I corrected him, my voice cold and hollow. "She consumes people, resources, and reputations. She saw me tonight and did the math. She saw a girl in a cheap dress and decided I was a resource she could burn to make herself look brighter. She thought I was the path of least resistance." "She miscalculated," Callum whispered. "She used the wrong formula entirely," I said. I felt the anger boil over, but it wasn't a hot, messy anger. It was a freezing, structural rage. It was the kind of anger that builds skyscrapers and destroys empires. I looked at Beatrice, who was currently lecturing a waiter about the temperature of the champagne. She had looked at me and seen a surplus requirement, an error in the family ledger that needed to be deleted. Dominic and Genevieve walked toward the center of the floor. The DJ, following my earlier command, slowly faded the music. Dominic took the microphone, his eyes scanning the room until they found me in the shadows. He didn't offer a smile. He gave me a look of pure warning, a stay-in-your-place glare. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic began, his voice booming with a false confidence. "Tonight is about family, and while some members of our family struggle with stability and reality, we believe in charity. A few guests turned to look at me, whispering about the unstable sister. He was trying to bury me before I could even speak. "Dominic," I said, stepping out from behind the curtain. I didn't need a microphone. "The charity is over." I walked toward the center of the stage, my heels clicking like a countdown. Every step felt like a nail in the coffin of our relationship. I took the microphone from his shocked hand and turned to the giant LED screen. "Chapter 1 is over," I whispered, staring into his terrified eyes as the screen flickered to reveal the deed of the estate in my name. "Now let's talk about the debt." The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it could crush the lungs of every person in that room. On the massive LED screen behind me, the legal deed for the Glass estate glowed in stark white and black. The name Sloan R. Holdings, LLC, was underlined in bold, a digital guillotine hanging over the festivities. Dominic's face went from a healthy, sun-tanned bronze to the color of wet ash. Beside him, Genevieve looked like she had seen a ghost, or perhaps something worse, a person she could no longer bully. "What is this, Sloan?" Dominic hissed, reaching for the microphone in my hand. His fingers were trembling. "What kind of sick prank is this? You're off your meds again, aren't you? Someone get her off the stage!" He turned to the security guards, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. "Callum, why are you just standing there? I'm the client. I'm paying for this. Remove this delusional woman." Callum didn't move an inch. He stood at the edge of the stage, hands clasped behind his back, his face as unreadable as a tombstone. The other 5 guards remained at the exits, their presence suddenly feeling less like protection and more like a blockade. I looked at Genevieve. "You were so worried about the stench of my cheap clothes ruining your party," I said, my voice amplified by the speakers, echoing into every corner of the ballroom. "But you didn't realize that the very air you're breathing in this room is provided by my ventilation system. The floor you're standing on was polished by my staff. And the wine you just poured on me? I'm the one who authorized the purchase of that vintage for the estate's cellar." "You're lying!" Genevieve shrieked. Her carefully curated it-girl persona was cracking, revealing the ugly, panicked social climber underneath. "You're just a pathetic, jealous loser who lives in a studio apartment. Dominic told me everything. You beg him for rent money." I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that cut through her screaming. "Dominic told you I beg for rent? That's interesting." I tapped my phone screen, and the image on the LED wall changed. It wasn't a deed this time. It was a bank transfer ledger. "This is the rent I beg for," I said. June 12th, $650,000 wired to Dominic's creditors to stop the foreclosure on our parents' house. September 19th, $85,000 for a certain 4-carat emerald-cut ring. October 3rd, $120,000 for startup operating costs, all paid by SR Holdings. The murmurs in the crowd turned into a roar of scandalized gasps. Dominic looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Beatrice marched toward the stage, her HR manager scowl in full force. She looked like she was about to try and fire me from my own life. "I don't care what kind of technicality you've found, young lady. This is a private event. We have a contract." "You're absolutely right, Beatrice," I said, leaning into the mic. "We do have a contract, and you should have read the fine print, specifically Clause 14B, the Morality and Harassment Protocol." I gestured to the screen one last time. The text of the clause appeared in giant, clinical font. Management reserves the right to unilateral, non-refundable termination of any event if the client or their guests engage in verbal or physical harassment, abuse, or discrimination against any member of the staff or ownership team. 10 minutes ago, I continued, my eyes locking onto Genevieve's. The bride-to-be intentionally assaulted the owner of this estate with a glass of Bordeaux. She then proceeded to use classist slurs and verbal abuse in front of over 200 witnesses. I turned to the crowd, then back to the family on stage. The event is over, I announced. Effective immediately. The bar is closed, the music is dead, and you have exactly 8 minutes to vacate my property before the local sheriff arrives to escort you out for trespassing. Sloan, please. Dominic finally found his voice, stepping toward me with his hands out, trying to switch back to the loving brother persona. Let's talk about this in private. We're family. Think about the embarrassment. I thought about family for 3 years, Dominic. I interrupted, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice. I thought about family while I was eating instant noodles so you could eat steak. I thought about family while I was driving a car with no heat so you could look like a success. You didn't just let her pour wine on me. You let her pour wine on the only person who ever truly had your back. I checked my watch. 7:52 p.m. 7 minutes, Dominic. I suggest you start with the centerpieces. They're the only thing in this room you actually own. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It was a crime scene of social reputations. The 10-minute countdown I had initiated felt like a ticking time bomb. Guests were scurrying toward the valet like rats leaving a sinking ship, clutching their designer furs and whispering frantically into their phones. The prestigious image Genevieve and Dominic had spent months crafting was disintegrating in real time. I was leaning against the mahogany bar, savoring a glass of sparkling water when the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. My heart tightened. It wasn't the sheriff. It was my father, Frank, and my mother, Martha. They hadn't been on the stage during the wine incident. They had been in the VIP lounge, probably bragging to some local politicians about their successful son. They marched toward me, their faces twisted in a mixture of confusion and unadulterated shame. Sloan, what on earth have you done? My father roared, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. Dominic just told us you've had some kind of breakdown. He said you stole the estate's credentials and are trying to ruin his life. My mother grabbed my arm, her grip tight and painful. Look at you, covered in wine, acting like a common street thug. Do you have any idea how much we sacrificed to give you a good name? And you repay us by humiliating your brother on the most important night of his life? I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the expensive jewelry my mother was wearing, the same pearls I had bought her for her 60th birthday, which she had told everyone was a gift from Dominic. I saw my father's bespoke suit, paid for by a bonus Dominic claimed he'd earned, but which had actually come from my personal dividends. Sacrificed? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Tell me, Dad, what exactly did you sacrifice? Was it the house in Queens that was 2 days away from the auction block before I stepped in? Or was it the pride you lost when you started lying to everyone that Dominic was the one saving the family? My father flinched. That was a family matter. Dominic is the man of the house. It was only right that the help came through him. The help came through me, Dad. I was the one who worked 18-hour days. I was the one who lived in a studio apartment with a leaking ceiling so you could keep your garden and your dignity, I said, my voice rising. And Dominic, he didn't just take the money. He took the credit. And you gave it to him willingly because you were too ashamed to admit your daughter was more successful than your golden son. At that moment, Dominic and Genevieve rushed over, followed by a fuming Beatrice. Genevieve's mascara was running down her face in ugly black streaks. You're a monster, Sloan! Genevieve screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. You're doing this because you're lonely and bitter. You're trying to steal our happiness. Steal it? I stepped closer to her, so close she had to lean back. I'm not stealing it, Genevieve. I'm repossessing it. Everything you see, this venue, the catering, the security, is mine. And as for your future husband, I turned to my brother. Dominic, tell them. Tell them about the investor who keeps your company afloat. Tell them about the $650,000 grant you received last year. Dominic looked at our parents, then at Genevieve. He looked like a cornered animal. Sloan, don't do this. Not here. I'm doing it here, I said. I pulled out a final set of documents from my clutch, the original loan agreements. I didn't just buy this estate. I bought your debt, Dominic. I am your primary creditor. You don't just owe me an apology. You owe me nearly $1 million. And since you've breached the morality clause of our hosting agreement, I'm calling in the notes, every single one of them, effective Monday morning. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp. $1 million? Dominic, you said you were the one funding the Sterling merger. Dominic's silence was his confession. The look on Genevieve's face shifted from rage to a horrifying realization. She hadn't been marrying a prince. She had been marrying a beautiful, hollow shell held together by my money. You're foreclosing on your own brother? My mother whispered, horrified. No, Mom, I said, setting my glass down on the bar with a sharp clack. I'm foreclosing on a parasite. I've spent my whole life being the foundation you all walked on. Tonight, the foundation is moving. I suggest you all learn how to swim. I turned to Callum, who was waiting nearby. The 10 minutes are up. Clear the room. If anyone, including my family, is still inside in 60 seconds, call the authorities and file for trespassing. The night air on the balcony was sharp, carrying the scent of salt from the nearby Atlantic. Behind the glass doors, the chaos of my former life was being systematically dismantled. I watched through the reflection as Callum and his team moved with clinical efficiency, ushering the remaining stragglers toward the heavy oak exits. The grand engagement had officially become a mass evacuation. Dominic was the last to be escorted out. He stood at the threshold of the ballroom, looking back at the glimmering chandeliers and the polished floors one last time. He looked small. For 30 years, he had occupied so much space in my world, his ego casting a shadow that kept me in the dark. Now, stripped of my financial oxygen, he looked like a ghost haunting his own funeral. Genevieve had already fled, her silk train trailing through the dirt of the driveway, her mother Beatrice close behind, likely already calculating how to distance their brand from the impending Sterling bankruptcy. They were scavengers, and there was no more meat left on the bone. My parents stayed by the gate, waiting for me. When I finally walked down the grand stone steps of the estate, my wine-stained dress fluttering in the wind, my father stepped forward. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a desperate, hollow pleading. "Sloan," he started, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. We're your parents. Where are we supposed to go if you take the house? What will people say?" People will say the truth, Dad," I said, stopping a few feet away from them. "That you had a daughter who loved you enough to save you, and a son you loved enough to let him destroy her. You're worried about where you'll go? You'll go to the condo I bought in Florida last year. It's modest, it's quiet, and it's in my name. You can live there, rent-free, for the rest of your lives." My mother let out a breath of relief, but I held up a hand. "But there are conditions," I continued. my voice ice cold. Dominic is never allowed to set foot on that property. You will not give him a dime of the allowance I provide you. If I find out you've helped him hide from his creditors or fueled his delusions for one more second, the locks will be changed before sunset. The era of the golden child is over. From now on, you live on the mercy of the scapegoat. They stood in stunned silence, realizing that the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been demolished and rebuilt in my image. They nodded slowly, the weight of their new reality sinking in. They weren't my masters anymore. They were my dependents. I watched them get into the car I had summoned for them. As the taillights faded into the distance, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. I expected to feel guilty. I expected to feel the old, familiar ache of not being good enough. Instead, I felt light. I felt like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for 26 years. I walked back into the ballroom. The lights were dimmed now, the staff moving silently to clear the broken glass and the half-eaten caviar. Callum approached me, handing me a fresh glass of sparkling cider. "The property is clear, Miss Sloane," he said, with a respectful nod. "The locks have been cycled. The sheriff has been notified that the event is officially closed." "Thank you, Callum," I said. "Tell the staff they're all getting a triple pay bonus for tonight, and tell them the estate is closed for the next month. I want some peace and quiet." "Understood, ma'am." I walked to the center of the floor, the very spot where Genevieve had poured the wine on me. I looked at the red stain on the wood that the cleaners hadn't reached yet. It was a permanent mark, a reminder of the night I stopped being a victim and started being the architect of my own destiny. I pulled my phone out and deleted Dominic's number. Then I deleted my mother's. Then my father's. I didn't need their validation to know I was successful. I didn't need their love to know I was worthy. I owned the roof over their heads, the ground under their feet, and the very air they breathed. Don't let your kindness turn you into a doormat. Work hard in silence until you're strong enough that no one can look down on you. Never hand the keys to your happiness to someone else. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Catch you in the next one.